I'd like now to begin looking at the diagnostic categories or chapters in the DSM. Now, the system is roughly the same as it was in the DSM-4, where each chapter represents a particular category of disorders, but what's different is the number of chapters and the specific way that they're lined up. So there are 20 different chapters because there are 20 different sets of categories, and we're going to look at them, and along the way I will try to highlight some of the more prominent changes and the ones that I was able to find out through my research at this point. So the first of these is called the neurodevelopmental disorders. Now, if you're familiar with the old book, there used to be a category called disorders usually diagnosed in infancy, childhood, and adolescence. But that category has since been disbanded. And what's gone on is that the APA has put a variety of those different disorders into particular other areas where they fit better. So what is now there is this category called neurodevelopmental disorders, and it includes autism spectrum disorder, as we've spoken about a few moments ago, and there will be notations there for the particular types of symptoms an individual will have, as well as the severity or impacts in their life. And I don't have the further details, but one of the things that's likely to happen here is that there will be apparently a need to collect or identify 2 behavioral symptoms instead of just 1 behavioral symptom from the autistic spectrum disorder diagnosis that existed before. Now, I want to pause just for a moment to help clarify for people what autism actually means, because many people don't understand. So autism as a disorder means that there are potentially 3 areas for the individual that are affected. The first is their communication, and we would expect to see the individual have delays in developing communication skills, particularly verbal communication. They may never develop verbal communication, or they may have very unusual or personalized approaches to communication. For example, they may use a process referred to as echolalia, where they say back what others have said or even what others have written. People may also have expressions that they use that are meaningful only to them or those who know them well. They may use language, for example, in an idiosyncratic way. So, for example, we may use the word door to refer to a specific object, whereas I worked with a consumer who used the word door to simply mean he was going to leave. And that's just one example. Often the words that are used are not even that clear, or they may not even be words. They could be concocted or imagined words or sounds. The second area for the person on the autistic spectrum that may be affected is their socialization. The individual may have difficulty connecting with others on a social level, may have difficulty reading the social fabric or reciprocating social behaviors by others. For example, the showing of affection or greeting people. They may not know how to take turns or share or play in parallel with other people. And these sorts of things can be very difficult to diagnose, because sometimes they are affected by the normal developmental influences of a child. For example, if a child grows up without much social connection because they don't have siblings and they're not put into preschool environments, these may not be evident until later on in the child's development. And the person who we used to refer to as having Asperger's disorder would be an individual who would typically have this problem but not have the communication issue. So they could verbalize on the same level as just about anybody else, but they would not have been particularly adept socially. And so this is what we used to refer to as the person who has Asperger's disorder. They had this social category as well as the one I'm about to go into, but they didn't have a particular communication deficit. And then the final area is the one that involves particular patterns of behavior by people with autism. And sometimes these are the things that stand out the most. The person may, for example, be engaged in routines just for the sake of routines. They may, for example, need to maintain the same schedule, or have things in their room set out the same way or on their plate in the same way. They may expect the people in their lives to be around them in the same particular order, or any combination of the above. They may have what we call stereotypic behaviors. These are often repetitive behaviors such as hand flapping or making the same sound repeatedly or rocking back and forth. And they may behave in ways that are atypical when playing. For example, I like to use the example of an individual who, instead of seeing a fire truck on the floor and using it in an imaginative way to roll around on its wheels and address fictional fires, would instead pick it up and repeatedly roll the wheels round and round and round and put it up to their ear, and never seem to grow tired of using that toy in that way. So these types of behavioral patterns often stand out in stark contrast to what other kids are doing developmentally, and we would typically think of a child as being diagnosed very early on in their life, and the symptoms of these behaviors and developmental delays would be evident normally before the age of 3 in most cases. But now that we're moving to an autistic spectrum disorder approach, clinicians will be able to sort of say that some of these exist and others don't, and apply the criteria based on severity and based on the uniqueness of the individual. And as I said, there will be some settling in as a result of that particular approach to diagnosis. Many people will have the benefit of more clarity in their diagnosis, but they may have the disadvantage if particularly governmental bodies respond by by creating a new line in the sand in terms of determining who gets funded and who doesn't. We should also mention about autism that it is widely perceived by the public that people with autistic spectrum disorders have lower IQs, and that is not always the case. And more we're becoming aware of people who not only have who don't have lower IQs, but in some cases have not only typical or average IQs, but may actually have higher than typical IQs in some areas. And another misconception that we should address here is the misconception of the autistic savant. And many people have seen the movie Rain Man and think that that behavior is actually quite common in the population of people with autism, when in actuality that is not typical. And when it does exist, where an individual has this small pocket of apparent genius or skill, it is often a very anomalous and not terribly functional behavior. For example, in the cases where this does occur, one of the more common examples is that people can do a perpetual calendar in their mind. You could give them a date anytime in the future and they could rapidly tell you what that day of the week would be. Another one is that they may be able to remember things that others would find very arcane or obscure. So for example, I worked with an individual who could tell you the key grip in the credits of almost any movie he'd ever seen. And that, as you might imagine, was somewhat impressive to people, but also not terribly useful. The second area we want to talk about is intellectual disability, which used to be called mental retardation. And I commented in class and online previously that I was very hopeful the APA would move away from this very antiquated term of mental retardation. And I think intellectual disability is the more socially valid and socially utilized terminology. And while I'm waiting for details on this, my understanding as well is that they have removed the specific criteria for each category. In the old APA manual, it was rather confusing because the one thing that it did say is that an intellectual disability began where an individual had an IQ below 70. And my understanding is that that will still remain. But what was unclear was whether or not an individual had what we call a mild, moderate, severe, or profound disability, because the lines that were drawn in the amount of IQ, so to speak, an individual had were literally very blurry. And so the APA has reportedly removed some of these categories and tried to make it more about specifically describing individual traits and capabilities and summarizing a more intensive adaptive assessment of an individual. Number 3, there's a change to the way the APA is going to allow for the diagnosis of people with learning disorders. In the old days, it said basically that people could be described as having a reading disorder, an arithmetical disorder, or I believe it was a expressive speech and writing disorder. Now they're recognizing that saying that an individual has a reading disorder is a fairly meaningless statement because there is a wide variety of these disorders. And so instead, there are specific reading disorders that will be identified or writing disorders that will be identified. And we all are familiar, for example, with dyslexia, which literally means dyslexia is difficulty reading, but there are actually other disorders, and people will start to get a more clear understanding as we move forward that there is more than just one type of reading disorder. ADHD, coordination disorders, and speech development disorders and so forth will remain in this category. But many others that were in this category have been given separate categories and lumped in elsewhere. The second category is used to be called schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, but you'll notice now that they've used this word spectrum again, and they have taken away the subtypes of schizophrenia. We'll talk more about that later on in terms of what are the symptoms and how they were used to be called subtypes. The essential reason for this is that many people did not fit neatly into the subtypes and were often more of a mixture of the various symptoms. So a more honest and realistic approach was again to identify the particular symptoms of the individual and how severe they were for that person, as opposed to just putting them into a simple pigeonhole. Number 3, instead of having a category called mood disorders, now the DSM has said they're going to create 2 chapters because they recognize that the psychopathology of these, the chemistry and so forth of the brain, are not identical for disorders that are bipolar and for depressive disorders. And we'll speak more about bipolar disorder later on, depressive disorder as well. So depressive disorders, as you might imagine, refer to depression, and bipolar disorders refer to people who have cyclic moods, normally between high mania and low depression, although there are variations on that we will explore. And they've also created this category, well, not created this category, but limited in this category called anxiety disorders. So that category of disorders existed before, but now it is a smaller category that's particularly focused on things like generalized anxiety disorder, panic attacks, and so forth. And we'll speak more about those in a while as well. Category number 6 is one of the things that was taken out of anxiety disorders and created for itself, and there are other changes. So now category 6 is called obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. As I said, that's a new section, and they have added two new disorders here: hoarding, which many of us have come to be familiar with through simply watching television programs, and excoriation, which simply means skin picking. And there are people who do this in much the same way as we used to describe people who are hair pullers, and that's called trichotillomania. Trichotillomania has gone from being an impulse control disorder to an obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is probably a more logical place for it. And body dysmorphic disorder that we referred to a little earlier, where people might identify that a part of their body in their perception is not actually theirs, I should say. They have also taken the category of the anxiety disorders and broken out this category now and called it trauma and stressor related disorders. And this is where we would see things like acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And for example, we now are becoming more and more aware of post-traumatic stress disorder because of so many veterans coming back from places like Iraq and Afghanistan suffering the effects of these disorders. So acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder are actually fairly closely related, and for the non-clinician the distinctions are not terribly important, but basically what they refer to is a person going through repeated traumatic patterns, flashbacks and physiological effects as a result of recurring symptoms from a significant trauma. And that trauma could be in a car accident, it could have been an assault, a sexual assault, episode in war, any number of things. Dissociative disorders is a remaining category. This is an interesting one. Many people have difficulty understanding it. But when we talk about dissociation, we're referring to the opposite of association, when we put things together or connect things. Dissociative disorders are disorders that basically are reflected by things we normally think of as being seamlessly connected being disconnected. So for example, we normally can recall our memories on demand. But when we are going through a dissociative disorder, we may have amnesia that's situational. We cannot recall certain memories at certain times. Or our personalities may feel as though they're split and disconnected. And so this is where we would have an individual with a dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be called split personality. And a third example might be an individual depersonalizing. And what that refers to is what many people think of as an out-of-body experience, where their consciousness and their awareness of who they are seems to have been removed from their body. People sometimes report that they can actually see their body or feel that their body is actually not theirs, that they're kind of loosely disconnected, much the way that Peter Pan and his shadow became disconnected in that story. Next is somatic symptom disorders, which just used to be called somatoform disorders. And where we see soma or somatic, we know that we're referring to the body. So these are disorders that are manifested physically for people. Now, this category always contained what we call somatization disorder, and somatization disorders are disorders that come across as physical disorders even though the individual does not have any of the physical causations. When we go through a battery of tests, we would not find that the underlying physiology of this person supports a diagnosis of, for example, endometriosis or diabetes or diverticulitis, but their symptoms, what they experience every day, might include the same exact symptoms that you would experience if you had those. A person with endometriosis would experience changes in their period and changes in the pain level they had going through their period. A person who had diabetes would have hyper and hypoglycemia, and that would affect their moods. And the person who had diverticulitis would have that manifested through stomach cramps or intestinal cramps and having problems with elimination. But what we now know is that many times the pathology behind those symptoms is purely psychological. And we need to really be careful as we say that, because some people feel as though when that's said, it is dismissing the importance of their symptoms, when in fact all it is doing is saying the pathology or the root of that particular disorder comes from a different part of the body. It's no less important than if it's manifested in the pancreas or the intestines or the uterus. It's simply a different root and therefore requires a different intervention. But also in this category is hypochondriasis. We all know about hypochondria, where a person would basically report to their physician that they were ill or suspect that they had a more serious ailment, I should say, than their symptoms would point to. And this can happen because of a person basically having an overly high degree of concern or stress about their illness. But it is not the same as a person who is faking their symptoms or who are strictly just going to drug seek because they're addicted to a substance. This is a person who genuinely believes that that freckle is cancer or that that cough is lung cancer, and they have a tremendous amount of stress as a result of that. Now, there used to be an entirely different section in the book. In fact, it was the shortest section, and it was for something called factitious disorder. And I like to remember factitious disorder by thinking about the first syllable of it, and it sounds similar to saying fake. Now, the person who has factitious disorder is an individual who has not believed that they're ill, but in fact presents the symptoms of an illness or reports the symptoms of an illness to a clinician or to family or to others in their lives as a way of getting acceptance and social attention and support from people. It's a pattern of behavior. Now, this is different from the person who's faking it so that they can get extended health benefits or get employment insurance. That's an entirely different thing as well. And that last one doesn't fit into this category. In fact, it's not a mental illness, it's just fraudulent behavior. So, the somatic symptom disorders really are about the way a person's mental health intersects with their conceptions of physical health. There are a number of disorders also around feeding and eating, and this is where you would see, for example, people who were categorized as having anorexia nervosa or bulimia or binge eating or compulsive eating. So these are people who would sometimes eat excessively or eat in a very limited way, or do both, eat excessively and then eliminate the food from their body by the use of things like laxatives or emetics, in other words, making themselves throw up. Category number 11 is elimination disorders. These are people who have issues around urination or defecation, and they may be doing that too much, too little, and so forth. And again, this can be affected by psychology. For example, a person may wet the bed. And this used to be in the childhood disorder category because it's commonly associated with children who wet the bed as a response to stress, but it isn't limited to children, and so that's why it's been moved. Number 12 are sleep and wake disorders, so people can be hypersomniacs, meaning they sleep too much, hyposomniacs, meaning they sleep too little. They can have erratic sleep patterns, or they can be insomniacs, meaning they sleep really not at all. There are sexual dysfunction disorders, so these are people who, for example, have disorders such as erectile dysfunction that's secondary to mental mental causation, or vaginismus. Vaginismus is when a woman would have her vaginal canal become tightened or so restricted that during sexual interaction she could not experience penetration, and this is normally caused by a psychological underlying cause. Gender identity disorders used to be in their own category and now are referred to as gender dysphoria, but this is the sort of disorder where an individual would conceive that their body and their identity were separate from one another, that they were not a male, they were a female, even though they were in a male body, and vice versa. Number 15 is a relatively new category, and I say relatively because it used to be called impulse control disorders, but what's happened is they've really lumped in things that perhaps fit better together, and these include disruptive behavior disorders and conduct disorders. Whenever you hear conduct disorders, what you basically can refer to this as a severe behavioral problem with an individual that is beyond sort of a situational response. And these can include things like IED, which is intermittent explosive disorder, where a person would go from being a calm, happy, well-settled individual to suddenly and dramatically having an explosion of anger and perhaps violent behavior, and often would go right back to being a calm, happy person soon after. And then there's ODD, which stands for oppositional defiant disorder, and these are people that have particularly acute and dysfunctional patterns of behavior of not being able to engage with anybody who may represent an authority, and that could be the law, that could be teachers, that could be their parents or anybody else. Now, what used to be in this category were disorders such as pyromania, which was impulsive fire setting, and kleptomania, which was an impulse to steal. But these have been removed as separate disorders, and they are now lumped into the conduct disorders section. And the reason for this is that the APA, through their research, established that these particular behaviors rarely occurred in isolation to the degree that they could significantly be thought of as a disorder unto themselves. What this means is for people who are working with individuals who have these symptoms, there are probably other behaviors that occurred before and while they were engaged in things like pyromania and kleptomania that would be part of their overall disorder. For somebody, for example, who is investigating individuals in fire setting, these might give them some clue in terms of understanding what type of personality would set fires or would steal things for no other apparent reason but for the thrill of it. Number 16 is the category that used to be called substance-related disorders, and now it's called substance use and addictive disorders. This particular category will also be of major interest to me as I get my copy of my manual. But what I've been told and what the research indicates is that instead of having each individual aspect of a drug's use being considered a specific disorder, as they used to do in the DSM-4, now they will see these disorders integrated into one pattern or one syndrome thought of as an addictive disorder. In the old DSM-4, it literally used to refer to intoxication and use and dependency and withdrawal all as being different disorders. And of course, that would mean that an individual could walk into a clinic under the influence of a drug and stay for treatment and go through 4 diagnoses in the space of a few days, where in actuality we would all normally think of that as a related issue. Number 17 is the neurocognitive disorders category, and this used to be called delirium and dementia and related disorders. And this actually is mostly referring to dementia, which is a disorder associated largely with aging, and we'll speak more about it later on. Number 18 is the personality disorders section, and this is still going to exist, and they will still have the same 10 diagnoses, and we will examine these more later on. But they've added this trait-specified approach that we spoke of earlier, where they've allowed the psychiatrist or psychologist to say, well, this individual doesn't specifically meet one of the 10 types, but they do have a number of other criteria that we can specifically note, and we'll call them a trait-specified personality disorder. And so the notation for that will be PTS, and that's going to be probably an abbreviation that you'll begin, sorry, PDTS, and you'll probably begin to hear that abbreviation. Paraphilic disorders used to be called paraphilias, and there hasn't been a substantial change in what's included here, But they have added these notations or distinguishers saying that a person may be using their particular behavior in a controlled environment, suggesting it's not harmful, or that the person may be in some remission, that they once experienced these particular paraphilias, but that they have stopped exhibiting them in concrete ways at this time. And then there's going to be a category called other disorders, and it will include a new disorder called suicidal behavioral disorder, where an individual is engaging behavior that reflects an apparent interest in committing suicide, but is not particularly at this point an active attempt at suicide. And we'll need to wait to hear more details on that.